Hearts Divided by Sebastian Reed. The autumn wind whispered through the Virginia pines, carrying with it the distant echo of cannon fire. Caroline Matthews stood at her bedroom window, her fingers absently tracing the delicate lace curtains as she watched the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The year was 1863, and the world she had known since childhood was crumbling like the leaves that danced across her family's once pristine lawn. At 20 years old, Caroline had already witnessed more of war's brutality than any proper Southern lady should. Yet here she stood, not in her usual fine silk gowns, but in a simple cotton dress, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid rather than the elaborate styles she once favored. The Matthews plantation house had been converted into a makeshift hospital months ago, and Caroline had traded her needlepoint for nursing, much to her mother's dismay. Miss Caroline, young Thomas, one of the few remaining stable boys, came running up the drive, riders approaching, their flying Union colors. Caroline's heart quickened, but not from fear. She hurried down the grand staircase, her practical boots clicking against the wooden steps. In the entrance hall, she found her mother, Eleanor Matthews, already issuing orders to the household staff. "Caroline, dear, please retire to your room," Eleanor commanded, her voice steady despite the worry lines creasing her forehead. "No, mother. If they're bringing wounded, they'll need every pair of hands we can spare." Caroline's quiet determination had grown stronger with each passing month of the war. Before Eleanor could protest further, the thunder of hooves announced the arrival of their visitors. Through the windows, Caroline could see a small contingent of Union cavalry, their blue uniforms dusty from the road. But it was the man leading them that caught and held her attention. Major James Harrison dismounted with the fluid grace of an experienced horseman, despite the makeshift sling supporting his left arm. Caroline recognized him immediately, the Union officer who had been brought to them 3 months prior with a bullet wound to his shoulder. The same officer whose fever she had tended through countless nights, whose blue eyes had captured her thoughts in unguarded moments since his departure. "Mrs. Matthews," James called out, removing his kepi with his good arm as he approached the house. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we have wounded men in need of care." Eleanor drew herself up to her full height, every inch the plantation mistress. "This is still a house of healing, Major Harrison, regardless of the color of the uniform." Caroline moved to stand beside her mother as James reached the bottom of the porch steps. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the war seemed to fade away. She saw the same recognition in his gaze, the same memory of whispered conversations during long nights of fever and pain. "Miss Matthews," he said softly, inclining his head. "I trust you are well." "As well as can be expected, Major." Caroline fought to keep her voice steady. "How many wounded do you bring us?" 5 men, none critical, but all in need of proper medical attention." His eyes never left her face. "We were ambushed by Confederate scouts near the creek. These men can't travel further without risk." Over the next few hours, Caroline worked alongside Dr. Morrison, their elderly town physician, tending to the wounded Union soldiers. James stayed close, helping where he could with his good arm, though Caroline suspected his presence had more to do with watching over his men than any medical necessity. As twilight deepened into night, Caroline found herself alone with James in the makeshift dispensary, organizing supplies by lamplight. The familiar scent of herbs and medicines mingled with the autumn air drifting through the open window. "You've become quite skilled at this," James observed, watching as she efficiently rolled fresh bandages. "War leaves little room for maintaining the delicate sensibilities expected of a Southern lady." Caroline gave him a wry smile. "Though Mother still hopes I'll somehow emerge from all this unchanged." James stepped closer, close enough that Caroline could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, a reminder of their first meeting. "Some changes, Miss Matthews, are worth embracing, even when they go against everything we were raised to believe." She met his gaze directly, allowing herself this moment of honesty. "Especially then." His voice was soft but firm. "This war has taught me that the lines we draw between North and South, right and wrong, are rarely as clear as we once thought." Caroline's hands stilled on the bandages. "And what are the lines between enemy and friend, Major Harrison?" "James," he corrected gently. "After all we've shared, I think we're well past such formalities, Caroline." The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. "James," she whispered, testing the feel of it on her tongue. He reached out, his fingers barely brushing hers across the table. "I never thanked you properly for saving my life. I merely did what any decent person would do." "No," he shook his head. "You did more than that. You showed me kindness when you had every reason not to. You spoke to me of poetry and philosophy during those endless nights of fever. You helped me remember that there's more to life than this war." Caroline felt tears well up in her eyes. "And now you've returned, bringing more wounded to our door. Is that the only reason?" James's hand closed over hers. "You know it isn't." The sound of approaching footsteps forced them apart. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Caroline, dear, Dr. Morrison needs assistance with changing Private Cooper's dressings." "Yes, Mother." Caroline gathered her composure and moved toward the door, but James's voice stopped her. "Miss Matthews, I wonder if I might have a word with you tomorrow morning. There are some medical supplies we need to discuss." Caroline caught the real question in his eyes. "Of course, Major." The rose garden would be most suitable for such a discussion. At dawn. That night, Caroline barely slept, her mind filled with thoughts of James and the impossible situation they found themselves in. She knew the dangers to her reputation, to her family's standing in the community, to her heart. Yet she couldn't deny the connection that had grown between them, planted during those fever-filled nights, and nurtured by their shared love of literature and learning. The rose garden was shrouded in morning mist when Caroline slipped out to meet James. He was already there, standing among the few remaining blooms of autumn, looking every inch the Union officer in his cleaned and pressed uniform. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," he said, turning to face her. "I almost didn't." Caroline wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "This is madness, James." He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "Is it madness to find light in the darkness of war? To discover that love knows no boundaries of north or south?" "Love?" Caroline's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, love." James took her hands in his. "I've tried to deny it, to tell myself that it's impossible, that the timing is wrong, that we're from different worlds. But these past 3 months, every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face. Every time I heard poetry quoted around the campfire, I remembered your voice reading Wordsworth in the candlelight." Caroline felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "What future could we possibly have? My family would never accept a Union officer as a suitor. Your family would likely feel the same about a Southern girl. The war won't last forever, Caroline." James reached up to brush away her tears. "And when it ends, the healing must begin, not just for our nation, but for all of us who have lived through this madness. Why shouldn't that healing start with love?" Before she could respond, James pulled a small book from his pocket, a worn copy of Wordsworth's poems. "I carried this with me these past months, the same edition you read to me during my recovery. Every time I opened it, I felt closer to you." Caroline touched the book's weathered leather cover. "James, He pressed the book into her hands. "Keep it. Let it be a promise that when this war is over, I'll return. Not as a Union officer, but as a man in love with a remarkable woman who taught him that the heart knows no borders. And if you don't return," she had seen too many promises broken by war to not ask, "then know that you gave me something worth fighting to survive for." James lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Something far more precious than any cause or country. The sound of the house stirring to life reached them through the morning mist. Their time was running out. Caroline knew she should pull away, maintain the proper distance that their circumstances demanded. Instead, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a swift, soft kiss to James's cheek. "I'll keep the book safe," she whispered, "and my heart will keep its own counsel until we meet again." James's smile was bright enough to pierce the morning fog. "When the war ends, I'll come back to this garden. Wait for me?" "Yes," Caroline answered, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'll wait." They parted as the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the rose garden. By mid-morning, James and his men had departed, leaving only memories and a book of poetry behind. Caroline watched them ride away from her bedroom window, just as she had watched them arrive. But this time, her heart rode with them, carried by a Union officer who had taught her that love, like healing, knows no boundaries. She opened the book of poems, finding comfort in the familiar verses, and allowed herself to hope for a future that war had taught her to believe impossible. In the years that followed, Caroline would often return to the rose garden at dawn, Wordsworth's poems in hand, reading quietly to herself and remembering. And when peace finally came to their divided nation, she found herself there again one morning, the book open in her lap, when the sound of approaching hooves made her look up. A familiar figure in civilian clothes was walking through the morning mist, and Caroline's heart recognized him before her eyes could confirm it was James. He had kept his promise, crossing the boundaries of north and south to return to her, proving that even in a nation torn apart by war, love could build bridges stronger than any cannon could destroy.